Hey guys, thanks for coming in here. I'm gonna get started because, yeah, I got a whole bunch of stuff to do. Not a lot of time to do it in. And we're gonna talk about earnest money though. So I can see the excitement in all of your faces when I say we're gonna talk about earnest money. What I wanna do though is make sure that we are handling it properly and getting everything done. So first thing, everybody knows we have our earnest money deposit site, right? em.c21connectrealty.com. It is a direct link for the buyer to make their earnest money deposit when Century 21 Connect is holding earnest money, right? So thank you, Lanier, for closing that. With that being said, it makes life easy. You don't have to worry about picking up a check from your client, having your client send a check, having the check go missing. When we are holding earnest money, if they give you a check and you pick it up Saturday morning from the client, that doesn't mean you turn it into the office on Monday when we're back in the office. There's a white drop box out there by the help desk. You can drop it in there. When we're holding earnest money, if you get a check, it is a hot potato. You need to get rid of it absolutely as quickly as possible, right? So holding it until Monday is not good, not okay with the Georgia Real Estate Commission. So just trying to keep y'all all out of trouble with that. When we are doing it, just want to point out up here, check the ACH box if that is the way that they are delivering earnest money to us through the em.c21connectrealty.com, okay? So it is an ACH, right? The earnest money shall be delivered within X days of binding agreement date. Should almost always be, okay? And here's instances, go ahead, Worrell, question?
How many days can you get away with?
How many days can you get away with? We have one group that we do one business day after binding, or after due diligence is up. You can get away with whatever you can negotiate. So, for instance, say it's $20,000 in earnest money. We're not turning it in until after due diligence is over because I don't want my buyer to have to wait 8 days to get their money back, if that makes sense. But whatever you can negotiate. Most of the times we see 3 to 4 days, right? And it's not uncommon to put 3 business days in there. So you go binding on Friday, you don't want it to, you got to have time to get to the bank and do all that.
So you just add in special steps that it's business days?
All days you can do it one of 2 ways. You could put within blank days of binding agreement, you can do X dollars within 3 business days of binding agreement, right there in check C, and write business days in there.
Okay.
Or you can do in your contract that all days in the contract are business days and not calendar days.
Okay.
All right, so a couple different ways you can handle that. But yes, it is ACH when C21 Connect is holding money. You can check and ACH. It's one or the other, right? It's just saying we're going to deliver it either by check or by ACH. We never, ever take cash, right? And we as a brokerage don't accept wired funds into our trust account because we would have to pass that cost on to the client, and I don't want to charge them $30 extra.
And the briefcase doesn't fit in that earnest money drop-off box either.
No, briefcase is full of cash. Don't work, Mr. Rip. Good point. So getting earnest money, and that's not really the big thing that I wanted to talk about with earnest money. We all know that. We all should know all these things. These are everyday activities that you as professionals should know. What I want to talk about though is when a deal terminates, okay? So we go ahead, you're in due diligence, right? And what I will talk about here is our unilateral notice to terminate, right? So it requires one party to terminate and 2 parties to distribute the earnest money, right? So if you look at the boxes here, up top, the unilateral notice to terminate, you have to have a legal reason to unilaterally terminate a contract, okay? The buyer is walking away and they're giving the earnest money to the seller, they don't care. You would not use a unilateral termination. That's not a valid legal reason for them to terminate. You'd use a mutual, which I'll get into that in just a second. But up here on the unilateral, You have to choose one of these options, right? And the buyer or the seller have to sign. But when it comes to distributing the earnest money, we have an and, right? So it requires both parties to agree on the disbursement of earnest money. Pretty typical, we deal with them all the time. Due diligence, buyer and seller, everybody signs. A lot of times you'll see both parties sign the top up there. It's not required, in case you ever see it and you're wondering. You know, only one person has to sign the top section, two on the bottom. The mutual termination, which I'll pull up here.
And that one, Dwayne, I've never had it happen, but if somebody's just like adamant of like, no, we're not releasing our earnest money, then does it just go legal?
Then it becomes an earnest money dispute, all right, which requires the holder to make a decision. If I'm holding, I have to make a legal interpretation of the contract and give the money to the party that deserves it.
And you can do that without consulting attorneys?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Which is the advantage of y'all holding earnest money?
Well, I do consult an attorney, our attorney on occasion, but in most instances, no. We as the holder doesn't have to consult anybody, and their decision is final. Neither the buyer nor the seller can sue the holder for making their decision either. All right, so, but as a broker, if I answer to the Georgia Real Estate Commission, so if I make just an outright wrong, I can be deemed incompetent and lose my license. If I don't make a decision, I can be deemed incompetent and lose my license. So there's a couple things there, but there's also interpleader actions that's going into a whole different category. So happens plenty that there is a dispute over earnest money, though. Go ahead, Lanier.
So are we not triggered to like refund earnest money until we get this signed from both sides?
Correct. Earnest money will not leave the account until both parties agree to how it's going to be dispersed.
And you also have to hold that for a total of how many business days?
In our ACH, it is 8 business days before I can release it. And that is due to ACH is like a check, and they can electronically put a stop pay on that check. And so our bank said it's 8 days. So it can take up to 3 days for it to clear the ACH, which is Automated Clearinghouse, is what that stands for if you weren't aware. So it can take up to 3 days for that to happen. So if they put a stop pay on day 5 and then it takes an extra 3, it's 8 days. So I won't release earnest money for 8 days. If you have a closing, which I think this happened to you, Rip, right? If you have a closing that's a short closing, don't have us holding earnest money, or you won't get paid at close. And if the earnest money is more than the commission to our side, that'll hold up the closing.
You mean less than 8 days?
Less than 8 business days. Business days, again.
It is a cash deal. But then, yeah, all of a
But
sudden,
the-
closing, they're like, hey, by the way, you can't get paid.
Yeah.
It's like, what? And they're like, this 20 grand earnest money can't be released.
The commission was over 20,000 though, so.
Yeah, that was, it was only like half my commission. Yeah, right. Checks are the same as
So-
far as the amount of days?
No, checks are actually sooner. So checks are 5 days.
Okay.
So same difference, but a check is just a headache, right? So that being said, let's jump back to the mutual termination. When the buyer is just walking away, or seller, you can come to a mutual agreement to terminate a contract, you'll always want to use a mutual termination. And it requires both parties to sign, as well as both real estate agents. So brokers, sellers, buyers, everybody has to sign it. And then we have the disbursement of earnest money in here. In some instances, if you can talk somebody into paying an amount to either the brokers or anything like that, which good luck with that one. If you're a strong negotiator, maybe you can, but 99.9% of the time, those are blank in earnest money to buyer or seller. All right, go ahead, Rip.
I've only used the unilateral. We use a mutual in what case?
In instances where we're terminating a contract and there is no legal reason for a party to unilaterally.
You're basically.
So the buyer's walking away. I've had this happen multiple times. The buyer's walking away and we'll get a unilateral termination that just says buyer doesn't want the property anymore. or buyer just decided not to move forward. Earnest money to seller. It's not a lawful reason. If you look at the top of the unilateral, it says or other lawful reason. You're only supposed to use that for lawful reasons.
Gotcha.
All right. End of the world? No, because the buyer was giving the money to the seller. They just said, we're walking away, we don't want it. So, not the end of the world, but technically, let's use the mutual termination. One of the big things I want to point out here is the disbursement of earnest money. What do y'all put in there?
Seller agrees to return X amount of earnest money
Back to buyer? Yeah, earnest money to buyer is the big one. Earnest money to seller, earnest money to buyer. Okay, go ahead.
So I just used one of these and just randomly thought of something that freaked me out the other day. So can you just put the seller agrees to return the full earnest money back to the buyer?
Yeah.
But the other day I put a number in there and then I thought I put the wrong
What if you were put the wrong number in? It would have caused it would have caused me as the holder to go, this doesn't match what I'm holding in my escrow account, so no, I can't release that. I need this fixed. So here, y'all fix this, figure it out, send it back to me. What are we doing with the other $500 or $1,000? All right. So the holder's just not going to release the money if you put a dollar amount in there and it doesn't match what they're holding. Or they shouldn't.
Yeah, I was just hoping it wasn't. Say it was like 2,500 and I put 2,000 and then the extra 500 goes back to the seller since
The buyer didn't, it didn't say.
amount was
No, that would be not clear.
Okay,
Earnest money is 100% clear, black and white.
gotcha.
Making the determination on who gets it, that gets in the gray area a lot, but when it comes to, it must say who's getting what in the exact amount. So earnest money to buyer, earnest money to seller, right? That works for y'all, but that doesn't work for the holder. How many of y'all have had the attorney reach out to you and go, where are we sending this to buyer? Where would the buyer like the money sent to? Where would how are we getting this money to the seller? How would they like it? You don't have to put that necessarily in the termination, but when you're sending it over to the holder to kill when the deal is dead and we have a decision, earnest money to buyer in here in your email, please send it to this person at this address. That's how I would like it done. That's my happy, wonderful world. That'll never happen though. It's all sunshine, rainbows and unicorns and sunshine, right? Yeah, that'll never happen. But that would be very helpful. It'll speed up the process because I sent out 2 emails today back to agents and said, where's the buyer want this? For the seller, when the seller's getting earnest money back out of the deal, the buyer backs out or whatever, and the seller is getting the earnest money, that is considered taxable income to the seller. Okay, so we need a W-9. So if y'all didn't know that. Earnest money, it's the buyer's money, right? The buyer lost it and the seller is getting it. That is considered taxable income to the seller.
Makes sense.
All right, so we need a W-9. They're gonna get a 1099 at the end of the 1099 miscellaneous at the end of the year for the money they received.
That to them, the holder?
The holder should, yes. So in those instances where your seller is getting it, get a W-9 off the internet, send it to your seller, say, hey, a lot of attorneys don't ask for it. I don't know why. They don't, but they don't. Maybe because they already have the seller info sheet with social security numbers and all that, and they'll just send a 1099 out. I don't know exactly, but it is taxable income, and just get one. Say, hey, be prepared for this seller. Having that up front with any brokerage is going to do it, is going to require you to provide a 1099 or a W-9. So get it and say, hey, you're going to need this. Here's who you'll send it to. You don't want that coming through you as well because it's their private information. So reach out to them, contact them, and confirm.
Kind of going off Borel's question, I'll probably never have this happen, but I recently had like an overly sweet, nice client, like a little sickening, like that to that point. But I would not have been shocked if the buyer canceled. She'd have been like, you know what? let them at least keep half their earnest money.
You'd be surprised at how often that happens.
So you can do like a split
Yes, you can split it there. It's all a negotiation at the end of the day. Buyer, usually when it happens, it's something along the lines like buyer loses their job, you know, and they're having to walk away, and it's $10,000 earnest money. Well, the seller goes, as the buyer's agent, you go, he lost his job. I mean, can you give him a break? You know what I mean? Can we split it or something? Your seller's not out $10,000. They may, you know, if we look at it. So is there any way we could split it? In that case, do a mutual and type out the who gets what. That way everybody signs off on it.
Okay.
Makes sense?
Yep.
Any other questions on earnest money? If we're holding and you're working with the buyer, you can also say earnest money to buyer and put in there holder to keep holding, or you can send that in an email. Buyer would like the money held for their next transaction, however you do. Make sense? Go ahead, Worrell, you had another question?
I guess just for, everybody to kind of know if they go through a situation like this, but what happens when, say you terminate someone, you agree to get the earnest money, but you've already found another house and go under contract with that one, pretty much within 24 hours.
Within 24 hours?
But it's the same closing attorney, so
Same closing attorney, same holder? The holder is who I don't care who the closing attorney could change. The holder is what's going to matter.
that's my bad. I guess in my situation, because we were supposed to close on a house, not closing, but my client already had wired the money to the closing attorney
For the closing?
for the closing. But, so now his earnest money is part of that as well. So, the closing attorney already had the
They're two separate line items for the holder. You have the earnest money line item, and there's separate line items on the HUD, on the settlement statement as well, right? So there's earnest money that's being held. That's one line item. And then total due is down at the bottom. So he wired the funds for the closing, plus his earnest money was already there.
Yeah.
All right? And the only thing that's at risk is the earnest money. The rest of the wired funds,
Yeah.
those go back to him. The attorney can reject the wire. They can just wire the money right back to him. Usually they like to reject it. That way it keeps it clean on their books. It makes it look like the money never hit their account. It was never their money, so that just makes it easier instead of paying to wire it back out as well. And then you have the earnest money that's a separate line item. So on the new contract, is it the same holder?
Same holder, yeah.
And it was the attorney both times?
Well, it was Century 21.
Okay.
Century 21 ended up sending it to the closing attorney. So now
For closing.
For a closing, yeah.
Yep.
So now that money is at the closing attorney. I'm
Yep.
not expecting it to come back to Century 21, is it?
Depends on what the buyer wants.
No, he wants it just to go to the.
He wants it to stay with the attorney?
So paperwork wise,
Okay.
what?
Paperwork wise, the only thing that you need paperwork wise is on your new contract. You should have checked via ACH, and the money is already on as of the offer date because it was already in the account. If you have it still due within 3 days, well, you're technically right, you know. But, you know, it'll be delivered within 3 days. What's already on hand, so that would be the correct one. Make sense? All right, very good. That's about all I got for y'all today on earnest money. Let's go. Turned into a longer one, huh? Start asking questions.